Honourable Leanne Dalzell.
Mr Speaker, thank you for the opportunity to speak on the third reading of the Motor Vehicle Sales Amendment Bill. This is a bill which has had quite a long history in terms of its both gestation and in terms of its traverse through the House. And I want to comment on all of those things as we did in the committee stages. First of all, I want to again comment on the history to how we've got to the position that we've got to today, because I think it is important that we have very good regulatory processes in place in order to assess the operation of a regulatory framework after it has been in place for a certain period of time. Now, the Motor Vehicle Sales Act 2003, which this bill amends, had within it a review after 2 years. Now, there would be those who would consider a 2-year review as too short. There would be those who would consider a 10-year review as too long. And I'm probably of the view that the 2-year review is too short. And although I think that this process was pretty robust in that it involved the review, which had a number of recommendations coming out of it, which then led to the development of a discussion paper that proposed amendments to the Motor Vehicle Sales Act, and then there were 18 submissions on the discussion paper, and then there was an open forum with industry and consumer representative organisations, and it engaged with the major stakeholders that one would expect to see involved: the Motor Trade Association, the Independent Motor Vehicle Dealers Association, the Motor Industry Association, the New Zealand Automobile Association and Consumer New Zealand Incorporated, and amongst many others. But I think the importance of the process was that these particular major stakeholders were able to engage quite fully in the process. But if it was a 2-year review after a piece of legislation that had come into force in 2003, and then that legislation and then the discussion document came out in 2007, and then the legislation was introduced in 2009, I'm starting to get a picture of actually things probably moved on during the period, and I personally think that the 2 years is too short. So just for future reference maybe, and we all learn as we go along in this particular role, I think that a review of this nature should have been 5 years, and it should have been, unless there were circumstances that required the urgent attention of the government that would bring it forward. I also think that we need to think about truncating the process, because I think we've doubled up here. There were 18 submissions on the discussion paper, and we received, I think it was 8 submissions on the bill at the Select Committee, and we heard 2 submissions. And so again, that's one of the concerns that I have, is that although it's a robust process, and again place on record our thanks to the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, who gave us very good support for dealing with this bill, I think that it possibly could have been dealt with a lot sooner if we had managed to get the process or the bill in front of the House a bit sooner than we did. Now, be that as it may, we got the bill in front of the House last year in about May. We reported it back from the Select Committee in December last year, and now we're in urgency finishing off the final reading. And it's actually. No, I don't think so, because it was my Select Committee, and I don't think I've ever had the pleasure of having Trevor Mallard on my Select Committee, and I kind of hope that it stays that way. Oh, nothing personal. Well, I don't think I could compete with that degree of testosterone. But there you go. The Motor Vehicle Sales Amendment Bill, Mr. Mallard. I thought we were speaking on cross purposes. The Motor Vehicle Sales Amendment Bill was reported back to this House on the 14th of December last year. The second reading didn't happen to the 22nd of June last year, and actually I went back and had a quick look at that, and I think that was dealt with under urgency as well. And now here we are completing the final stages of the bill under urgency, and I made the point during the committee stages that although the calendar on the wall says that it's the 24th of August. In fact, it's the 26th of August, and although we might have been, time may have stood still as far as the urgency motion goes, we actually we're debating this when our select committee actually should be meeting and dealing with another piece of legislation, but here we are in the House dealing with this. So if this was a question of urgency, then it really ought to have been dealt with sometime sooner. Now, the main issue that I focused on when we were in the committee stages on this bill was the question of the display of a consumer information notice. And I just wanted to comment on one of the submissions that we received at the Select Committee, because I thought it was the most appropriate submission to refer to with respect to e-commerce and the advent of Trade Me into the car market, as it were, through online car market operators. Now, according to the submission, the theory of the the current situation prior to this bill coming in theory, each of the 175,000 motor vehicle auctions on Trade Me in the past year would have had to include a consumer information notice. And of course, Trade Me provides advice to sellers in the car listing process that they must do this. But as the submission said, the reality was quite different. They said that the Commerce Commission had advised them in 2006 that they would only enforce this requirement against motor vehicle traders, and the Ministry of Consumer Affairs recommended in 2007 that the law be changed to remove this requirement on private sellers. And I guess in the meantime, it's generally only motor vehicle traders that have been displaying the consumer information notices. And the point that was made in the submission is this, and I guess this backs up the point that I was trying to make before about the time frame for review and action on those reviews, and that is that the amendment simply changes the law to catch up with the reality of what people are doing and what everyone seems to agree makes sense. So, and that's why when, unlike the previous speaker who said that our government actually didn't address red tape and compliance costs, I want to make the point that I was the minister that developed the model of the Regulatory Improvement Bill. Something like this doesn't actually need to be a separate piece of legislation. This could have been dealt with by way of amendments under the Regulatory Improvement Bill, and I think that's one of the things that we need to also contemplate as a Parliament, is having a much more open approach to a generic piece of an omnibus bill, a generic piece of legislation, able to pick up a range of compliance reducing initiatives that don't always get the priority of either the department, the minister, or the leader of the House in terms of the process that will be adopted for ensuring that it is able to be updated in a timely fashion. And so the sequence of events that I've spelled out in terms of the timing of the review, the discussion document, getting it to a bill stage, and then getting a priority in terms of the House means that something that was identified in 2006, according to this submission that we received from Trade Me, something that was identified in 2006 is being fixed in 2010. And that, to me, is the fundamental flaw that we have in our parliamentary system, is that this has to compete against changes to three strikes legislation. It has to compete with, things that the government might think are a priority, which most New Zealanders don't. And but they have to compete on that basis. So I would certainly recommend that we ensure that these things are kept up to date with sensible review periods, but also an action approach to implementing those changes. And I commend the third reading to the House.
I call David Clendon.